Hello friends, and welcome back to Lunar History. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey into one of the harshest environments humans have ever dared to call home, the frozen wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. Before we dive into the story, take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps more than you know, and it makes sure you don't miss the next adventure we bring to life. Now, imagine this. The year is 1830. You're deep in the Rockies, surrounded by endless white peaks that stretch into the clouds. The air bites at your skin the second you step outside. The wind doesn't just blow, it roars, carrying icy daggers that pierce through every layer of clothing. Out here, one mistake could be the difference between waking up tomorrow or not waking up at all. But this isn't just a tale of danger. It's also a story of human ingenuity, grit, and survival against all odds. For 60 years, men known as mountain men braved these conditions for a single purpose: to carve out a life where few dared to follow. They had no backup teams, no emergency services, and no modern comforts. Everything came down to knowledge, preparation, and sheer willpower. Picture yourself waking in the middle of the night inside a shelter you built with your own hands. The fire has burned low, the only thing standing between you and the kind of cold that could end you in less than an hour. You can hear the blizzard howling outside, rattling the log walls, testing every crack for weakness. Your breath hangs in the air, visible even in the dim glow of the dying embers. This is survival stripped to its core. What fascinates me most is how these men didn't just survive, they engineered survival. With nothing but axes, knives, and wilderness knowledge, they built shelters that could keep them alive for months in conditions most of us wouldn't last a single night. Every log, every stone, every piece of chinking between the cracks had a purpose. These weren't cabins built for comfort. They were life support systems carved straight out of nature. Tiny, we're going to step into their world. We'll see how mountain men chose the perfect site for a shelter, how they turned a pile of logs and stones into a fortress against deadly cold, and how their understanding of fire and heat made the difference between life and death. Along the way, you'll hear real stories of survival, mistakes that cost lives, and ingenious solutions passed down through generations. So, grab your blanket, settle in, and let's unravel the hidden genius of mountain survival. By the end of this story, you might look at your own home and the warmth inside it tend a whole new light. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this journey, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep creating stories like this and sharing them with adventurers like you. Now, let us step back in time and see what it really took to survive the deadliest winters on Earth. The truth is, life in the Rocky Mountains during the 19th century was not for the faint of heart, and the men who ventured into those high and unforgiving landscapes soon discovered that winter there was a relentless adversary that did not bend to human will. Imagine weeks where the sun barely showed itself, where daylight was more gray shadow than true light, and where each breath taken stung the lungs with a sharp, icy bite that reminded you constantly how thin the line was between existence and silence. These mountain men weren't only contending with the weight of snow piling endlessly on their roofs or the bitter winds that screamed through the valleys. Like some ancient force of nature, they were confronting storms so brutal that to be caught outside for even an hour without shelter meant certain doom. Temperatures could plunge to 30 degrees below zero, a kind of cold that didn't just to make your skin ache, but reached into your very bones, stiffening muscles, numbing thought, and draining life from anyone unprepared. It is one thing to sit in a modern home, wrapped in blankets, sipping something warm while hearing about such temperatures. It is another entirely to realize that these men endured those nights without electricity, without heaters, without the security of help a phone call away. Each snowfall threatened to trap them for weeks. Every gust of wind tested the walls they had built with their own hands, and every ember in the fireplace became a guardian against the encroaching cold. For them, winter was not a season to be tolerated. It was a trial by nature, a gauntlet thrown down by the mountains themselves, demanding respect, knowledge, and endless vigilance. The blizzards were not just flurries of snow. They were living walls of white, sweeping across the land with a force that swallowed trails, erased landmarks, and left even the most seasoned trapper disoriented within minutes. The winds were not simply chilly breezes, but punishing blasts capable of cutting through layers of fur and leather as if they were nothing more than thin paper. These storms howled through the valleys, pressed against the log walls of cabins, and found every small crack to slip inside, turning warmth into drafts that felt like knives. In such moments, survival was reduced to a simple equation. The fire must live, the shelter must hold, and the body must endure. Yet, what made these men remarkable was not that they survived one storm or even one winter, but that they returned year after year, willingly stepping back into a world where every day carried the possibility of disaster. They knew the mountains showed no mercy, and still they came, driven by the promise of fur, freedom, and a life lived on their own terms. With each season, they adapted, refining the art of reading the landscape, learning where snow would drift too heavily, which valleys would channel the most dangerous winds, and how to find that precarious balance between exposure and safety. So when we speak of the mountain men facing extreme winters, it isn't simply a tale of men shivering in the snow. It is the story of human beings locked in a constant dialogue with nature, where every decision mattered, every mistake carried a cost, and every success carved out just enough space to see another dawn. And as you picture these solitary figures silhouetted against endless ridgelines, remember that what they endured was not only about braving the cold, but about matching themselves against a wilderness that demanded everything they had and giving it, 'cause the alternative was unthinkable. What ultimately separated those who endured the long winters from those who were claimed by the cold was not simply the strength of their bodies or the toughness of their spirit, but the shelters they were able to construct. Because in a land where storms could rage for weeks without pause and snow could bury a man standing upright, the difference between life and death was measured in the skill with which a cabin was built from the raw materials of the wilderness. These structures were far from the picturesque log cabins we often imagine when thinking of frontier life. They were not built for comfort or charm, but were carefully engineered systems, each detail chosen with purpose, each log and stone positioned with survival in mind. The mountain men did not have sawmills or hardware stores. They had axes, knives, ropes, and an intimate understanding of the land, and with those alone, they created dwellings that could withstand winds strong enough to topple trees and temperatures that could freeze water in moments. To understand how important these shelters were, one must picture the process not as a matter of stacking logs in a rough square, but as a deliberate act of engineering that drew upon observation, experience, and an almost instinctive knowledge of nature's moods. A site could not be chosen at random. The men studied hillsides for natural windbreaks, watched the way snow drifted during early storms, and avoided valley bottoms where cold air pooled like water in a basin. The walls were more than barriers. They were defenses against an enemy as persistent as it was invisible, and every seam had to be sealed with mixtures of clay, dried grass, or even animal hair substances that trapped pockets of air and transformed crude log joints into insulation capable of holding precious heat. The roof was not simply a covering overhead. Its angle, its overlapping layers of bark or split wood, and the way it shed snow all determined whether the structure would protect its occupants or collapse beneath the weight of a blizzard. Inside, the fireplace was not a decorative hearth, but the very heart of the shelter. Designed with such care that the flames did more than provide light, they generated steady, controlled warmth that was stored by massive stones and released slowly into the air long after the fire had burned down. In many cases, These men experimented with chimney shapes and airflow until they discovered designs that maximized heat while minimizing smoke and waste, creating what were, in essence, primitive heat exchangers born entirely out of necessity and ingenuity. Sleeping platforms were raised deliberately above the frozen ground so that a man's body could rest in the warm layer of air that naturally rose, a detail that might seem small, but in truth meant the difference between shivering all night or waking with enough strength to face another day. What is most striking about these shelters is how nothing was accidental. Every notch in the logs, every placement of stone, and every decision of where to dig, cut, or build carried the weight of survival. To stand inside one of these cabins during a storm was to stand within a fortress designed not for battle, but for endurance. A fortress that turned the very materials of the wilderness wood, stone, clay, height into a shield against the killing cold. And when the wind howled outside, rattling the walls and clawing at the seams, the men who huddled by the fire understood that it was not brute strength that kept them alive, but their ability to shape knowledge, resourcefulness, paying the wild itself into structures that could withstand the wrath of the mountain winter. More than walls of timber, more than roofs angled against the crushing weight of snow, and more even than the furs and blankets that wrapped a man in the night. There was one element that truly decided whether he would see another sunrise in the Rocky Mountains, and that was fire. To those who lived through those winters, the flames were not merely a source of warmth or light, but the very heartbeat of existence, an unbroken rhythm that had to be tended with the devotion of a watchman who knows that if his guard falters, all will be lost. The mountain men repeated a simple truth among themselves, a truth carved out of countless tragedies and near misses. Fire dies, you die. It was not an expression meant to frighten, but a reminder, as constant as the wind that roared outside, that everything depended on keeping that small circle of light alive. Picture a night when the storm outside howls so fiercely that the sound seems to press in on the walls of your shelter. When the cold forces its way through every seam it can find, and the only thing standing between your body and the merciless grip of the wilderness is the glow of burning wood. The fire is not just heat, it is protection against frost that can seize a man's limbs before he realizes it. It is the difference between waking in the morning and never stirring again. Mountain men learned to read flames as others might read the sky. They knew how to add wood so carefully that the fire would grow without being smothered, how to coax embers back to life with the softest breath, and how to arrange fuel so that the heat would last through the endless hours of darkness. Their relationship with fire was not one of casual convenience, but of intimate partnership, and in those partnerships, mistakes were unforgivable. The preparation of wood was as deliberate as the construction of a roof. Smaller sticks were sorted with care for kindling, split logs chosen for their ability to hold embers through the night, and certain woods selected for quick ignition, while others for long, steady burning. Even the placement of a fire within a shelter mattered, for it had to give warmth without filling the room with smoke. It had to provide heat for cooking without wasting the precious fuel that might be needed days later. And it had to burn with a consistency that gave confidence in the darkest hours when the storm outside seemed determined to claw the life out of anyone within reach. Fire was the silent companion that needed constant feeding, constant protection, and constant attention. It's a companion that rewarded diligence with life and punished neglect with an end as swift as it was cold. There are stories told of men who grew careless, who let the flames dwindle in the deep of night, thinking they would rise before the cold grew dangerous, only to be found stiff and silent by their companions come morning. These tales were not told to sensationalize tragedy, but to hammer home the lesson that no matter how exhausted you were, no matter how heavy your eyes became, you tended the fire before you let sleep take you. For in those frozen peaks where winds tore through valleys like blades and snow buried the world in silence, the fire was not simply a tool. It was life itself, a fragile and flickering miracle that turned raw wilderness into a place where a human being could endure. And so every mountain man knew, with a clarity that could never be doubted, that as long as the fire lived, so too did he. Long before the first log was cut, or the first stone was set in place, the decision that mattered most was where the shelter would stand, because the mountains themselves were not forgiving of poor judgment, and a mistaken location could undo even the strongest walls or the most carefully tended fire. Site selection was not about finding the most scenic view or the easiest clearing, but about reading the land the way one reads an old and weathered book, each slope and ridge offering warnings or promises that only the attentive could hear. The mountain men knew from bitter experience that wind was not just an inconvenience, but a force capable of stealing warmth faster than fire could replace it. Avalanches were not rare accidents, but constant threats, where snow piled heavy on steep slopes and flooding in valley bottoms could turn the hard ground beneath a cabin into a frozen mire that rotted floors and chilled bodies. To walk the land with an experienced trapper was to watch him pause at subtle signs that a novice might miss entirely. A grove of trees leaning all in one direction revealed where prevailing winds tore through season after season, carving invisible tunnels of air that would strip a shelter bare in a single storm. A hollow at the base of a slope, seemingly protected, might in truth be a trap where cold air settled at night, creating temperatures far lower than the surrounding ridges. Even the snow itself told stories. The way it drifted against rocks, the way it melted slower in shaded hollows, the way it piled deeper on certain slopes, all spoke of the dangers that might come when the heart of winter arrived. Choosing a site was a kind of conversation with the wilderness, a negotiation in which the price of ignorance was death. Shelters built on ridgetops often succumbed to unrelenting winds, their roofs torn away, their fires choked by drafts that could not be controlled. Cabins placed too close to riverbanks were buried when spring thaws sent torrents of icy water spilling across the land. Those who survived longest were the men who learned to look beyond the surface, who sought out the southeast slopes where the sun offered its meager warmth, and where the mountains themselves stood as wind breaks against the bitter northwestern gales, behind rock outcroppings in the embrace of thick timber, or just far enough from avalanche-prone slopes. They found the narrow strips of safety carved into a landscape otherwise shaped to punish weakness. It is said that some of the most seasoned trappers would spend days walking and observing before driving a single stake into the bar ground, and though it may have seemed like hesitation to outsiders, it was in truth the most important work of all, for the placement of a shelter was the foundation upon which every other survival effort rested. You could build strong walls, you could tend your fire with vigilance, but if you built in the path of sliding snow, the mountain would bury you without hesitation. And if you chose a spot where winds funneled like arrows through a canyon, no amount of wood piled on your fire could stop the cold from piercing through. In this way, the act of selecting ground became the first true test of wisdom, requiring a balance of caution, observation, and patience. This was not about taming nature, but about aligning with it, finding those rare pockets where the earth itself offered some protection, however small, against the wrath of the winter sky. And so the mountain men learned often through the costly mistakes of those who came before them that survival began not with the cutting of trees or the lighting of flames, but with the quiet, deliberate choice of where to stand against the storm. Once a man had chosen his ground, the next question was how to let the land itself work for him, because in the mountains every advantage counted, and nowhere is this more evident than in the battle against the wind. The wind was not just a passing discomfort, it was the thief that stole warmth from a cabin faster than any fire could supply it, the invisible predator that slipped through the smallest cracks and turned the comfort of a room into a place of shivering dread. Those who understood this sought out nature's defenseless hillsides that curved like protective arms, towering boulders that broke the force of the gales, and dense groves of spruce or pine that stood like sentinels against the storm. To place a shelter in the lee of such features could reduce the demand on firewood by more than half, a difference that meant survival in a season when cutting and hauling wood was itself an exhausting, never-ending labor. Imagine walking a frozen slope, the wind tearing at your clothes and carrying fine snow that stings your face, and then stepping behind a natural rock wall where the air suddenly calms, the howl becomes a murmur, and the temperature seems to lift by degrees. In that moment, you feel the truth in your bones. Protection is not only about the walls you build, but also about the land you choose to stand beside. A cabin tucked behind such a barrier could retain its heat far longer, the flames inside working steadily rather than frantically, and the men within spared from constant trips into the storm to haul more wood. In a world where energy was measured in calories burned by muscles and breath, saving effort was as vital as saving warmth. The veterans of the mountains often spoke of the wisdom of leaning on nature's architecture. They would shake their heads at those who hurried to throw up walls in open clearings. Cavemen soon left to stand exposed like lone figures against the onslaught of the blizzard. The true art lay in making the earth itself part of your defenses. Trees, especially evergreens, were more than just markers on the landscape. They were allies. A thick grove absorbed the wind, forcing it to twist and lose strength before it ever reached the walls of a shelter, and at the same time those branches collected snow that piled into natural drifts, forming secondary barriers that insulated rather than harmed. Boulders and cliffs did the same, forcing air currents upward or sideways, creating pockets of stillness where a fire as heat could linger inside instead of being pulled relentlessly outward. What the mountain men discovered through trial, error, sometimes tragedy, was that wind could undo everything if not accounted for. But if you read the land correctly, you could turn that danger into a shield. The difference could be measured in the amount of wood consumed through a long winter with natural protection. A man might need half the fuel his less fortunate neighbor did, which not only saved his strength, but also reduced the risks of venturing out during storms when gathering wood could cost frost-bitten fingers or worse. It was a lesson that grew into a kind of gospel. Never fight the mountain head-on when you can let it fight for you. And so, the craft of survival was never only about axes, saws, and hard labor, but about respect for the subtleties of the land. By positioning themselves with hills at their backs, with stone at their sides, and with trees crowding close around them, the mountain men learned to bend the wilderness into an ally conserving energy and resources in ways that often determined whether the fire still burned come spring. Even with the best ground chosen and the strongest walls raised, no part of a mountain man's shelter was tested more cruelly than the roof. For it bore the direct burden of the sky itself, catching every flake of snow until its weight pressed down with a silent but relentless force. A roof in the Rockies was not simply a cover to keep out the weather. It was a shield against tons of white powder that could, in a single night, grow heavy enough to crush beams, splinter logs, and turn a safe haven into a frozen grave. Those who understood this reality treated the roof not as an afterthought, but as the crown of their survival system, and they built it with angles, layers, and strength calculated to withstand not just one storm, but the accumulated fury of an entire season. Imagine a blizzard sweeping over the peaks, snow falling so thick that it erases the world beyond a few feet, piling silently hour after hour until drifts reach the windows and climb higher still. Inside the shelter, the fire burns and the walls hold firm, but overhead, the real battle is being fought. Each flake may weigh almost nothing, yet when millions fall together, they become a crushing weight. And without the right design, that weight could bow beams until they snapped. The mountain men knew this not from books or diagrams, but from bitter experience, from stories of neighbors who woke to the sound of timbers cracking and found themselves buried in snow as their roofs gave way under the pressure. Such failures were rarely survivable. And so the lesson was engraved into every builder's mind. Build a roof that sheds the snow before it buries you. The solution was not simple, for a roof built to flat allowed snow to accumulate in dangerous layers, while one built too steep caught the fury of the wind, sometimes tearing away entirely in the middle of a storm. Finding the balance between these extremes required a kind of instinct born of observation and passed down in stories. A sweet spot angle where the snow would slide away in heavy sheets, yet the structure remained anchored against the gales. Logs were notched and joined with precision, their weight distributed so that no single beam bore the burden alone. And overlapping materials from bark strips to split shakes were laid in such a way that water from melting snow could drain without seeping into the cracks. Over time, the very shape of the roof became a reflection of survival knowledge. Not too flat, not too sharp, built always with an eye to what the mountain might throw down upon it. To stand inside one of these shelters during a storm and hear the muffled roar of snow sliding from the roof was to feel an almost indescribable relief, because each thundering fall meant that the structure had done its work, that the crushing weight had been cast off before it could destroy what lay beneath. Those who built with care often lived to see spring. Those who rushed their work or underestimated the weight of winter often became cautionary tales retold around future fires. And so the roof became more than lumber and bark. It became the line between endurance and oblivion, a lesson in humility taught by mountains that never forgave carelessness. The challenge of building a roof in the Rockies was not only about stacking logs and laying bark, but about finding the delicate balance between two opposing forces of nature. And it was in this balance that the mountain man revealed a kind of engineering wisdom that came not from books or blueprints, but from years of trial, error, and the hard lessons carved by storms. On one hand, the roof had to be angled steep enough that the snow would not linger and crush the structure under its tremendous weight. Yet, on the other, if that same roof was made too steep, it became a sail for the mountain winds, a broad surface against which the gales hurled themselves until beams strained and fastenings tore loose. The art of survival lay in walking that razor-thin line, creating an incline that shed the snow but still braced itself against the invisible fists of the storm. To watch an experienced builder at work was to see a man measure not with tools, but with memory, instinct, and wisdom gathered from countless winters. He would study the lay of the land, recall storms from years before, and calculate angles in his mind, not as numbers on a page, but as lived experiences. How much snow had piled on one roof, how another had collapsed when the pitch was too shallow, how yet another had been ripped away because the winds found purchase on its steep face. These men were not scientists in the formal sense, but their experiments were written into the scars of old shelters and the graves of those who had built poorly. Over time, they carried within them a library of empirical engineering, where each decision was weighed against the memory of what the mountain had done to those who chose otherwise. The structures that endured were those built with this balance in mind. A slope angled just enough to let snow slide off in heavy sheets would in the middle of a storm release. A muffled roar as tons of white cascaded safely to the ground, while the beams beneath flexed and held steady against the wind that clawed at them. Those who misjudged the angle too far in one direction or the other often found themselves paying for it in bitter fashion, waking to creaks and groans as the roof bowed inward, or watching in horror as a sudden gust tore away half of their protection. Such failures were never forgotten, and they became stories retold not to entertain, but to warn, teaching younger men that the mountain respected only precision. It is striking to think that without rulers, without calculations written down, these men built roofs that balanced two of nature's fiercest forces with a kind of accuracy that kept them alive through storms measured in weeks rather than hours. What they possessed was a practical science born in the field, where every decision was tested under conditions no classroom could reproduce. They relied on judgment honed by observation, by listening to the wind, by watching the way drifts formed and melted, and by carrying in their minds the knowledge of shelters that had failed and those that had endured. And in this way, Each roof was not merely a covering against the sky, but a statement of experience, a fragile truce between snow and wind, drawn by men who understood that in the wilderness the smallest miscalculation could mean the swiftest end. If the roof represented the delicate art of balance, then the walls of a mountain man's shelter represented the foundation of trust. And that trust began with the trees themselves, chosen not at random, but with a practiced eye that knew which species could endure the bite of winter and which would betray their builders when the storms bore down. It was never a matter of simply felling the nearest trunk, for the forest was filled with wood that looked sturdy yet carried weakness within, and to make that mistake meant raising walls that might split, warp, or collapse when the cold set in. Instead, the mountain men sought out trees like lodgepole, pine, and Douglas fir timber, whose very character spoke of resilience of fibers, tight and straight of strength, that had been tempered by decades of growing in high country where snow-bent branches and winds hardened their cores. The process of choosing was a kind of ritual, part instinct, part observation, and part memory of lessons passed from one man to another. Lodgepole pine, tall and straight as arrows, offered logs that fit tightly together, their slim but uniform shapes making them easier to notch and stack with precision. Douglas fir, by contrast, carried a heavier density and greater strength, able to bear loads without sagging, and when cut and placed with care, it formed beams that could shoulder the roof and laugh at the weight of a blizzard of snow. The mountain men knew that each species had its place, and they did not waste their effort with timbers that looked impressive but carried flaws. The grain had to run straight, free of twists that would weaken a wall, and the bark told stories of the tree's life. Whether it had fought off rot, whether it had endured storms without cracking, whether it would hold together through the coming winter. Even the season of cutting mattered. Trees felled in the wrong months carried too much sap, which would seep and shrink as the logs dried, leaving gaps where cold air slipped through and fire's heat escaped. For this reason, the trappers often took their logs in late fall or the dead of winter, when growth slowed and the wood was drier, knowing that these details, invisible to an untrained eye, could make the difference between a cabin that sealed tight and one that leaked precious warmth. Once cut, the logs were not rushed into place, but sometimes left to season, stacked carefully off the ground so that air could circulate and moisture could bleed away, strengthening the wood while reducing the chance of splitting when the deep cold finally arrived. To build with such care was not extravagance, but necessity. In the Rockies, every crack in the wall was an invitation to the wind, every weak beam a hazard that waited for its moment to betray its maker. Those who cut without thought often paid in endless hours spent patching, repairing, or cursing their choices as they shivered beside smoky fires that could not overcome the drafts. Those who selected with care, on the other hand, found that their cabins became true fortresses, their walls solid, their corners square, their seams tight enough that a single fire could warm the whole space through the blackest nights. And so, in the choice of logs, as in every other part of their craft, the mountain men revealed a truth that guided their survival. In the wilderness, strength begins not with muscle alone, but with the wisdom to choose what nature offers wisely and well. Walls of strong logs and roofs angled against the fury of winter were only part of the equation, for even the most carefully built cabin could betray its maker if the earth beneath it was not respected. The ground in the Rocky Mountains was not the firm ally it appeared to be, because beneath the snow it concealed dangers that were slower, subtler, but just as deadly as the storms raging overhead. Soil that seemed solid in summer could turn treacherous in winter as frost crept upward, drawing moisture into the base of a structure. Rotting timbers and wicking away heat with relentless efficiency. Cabin laid directly on the ground was a cabin condemned to dampness, and dampness in that climate was nothing less than an invitation to sickness, weakness, and ruin. The mountain men, through experience, earned the hardest way, came to understand that the secret to endurance lay not only in what they built above, but in what they raised beneath. And so they turned to stone and timber foundations as the invisible guardians of their survival. To see one of these shelters taking shape was to realize how deliberate every choice had to be. Before the first log wall was stacked, the builders cleared away snow, brush, and loose soil, digging down to reach firmer earth or exposed rock. Into that space, they laid flat stones gathered from riverbeds and slopes, fitting them like a rough puzzle that would lift the cabin a foot or more above the earth. Where stones were scarce, heavy timbers were notched and placed across smaller supports, forming a platform that allowed air to circulate beneath the structure. This elevation was not a matter of style, but of life itself, for by raising the floor, even a short distance, they severed the link between their shelter and the cold, wet ground that otherwise would have leached away every spark of heat. Imagine the difference on a night when the temperature outside fell to 30 below, when the wind scoured the valleys and snow piled high against the walls. Inside a cabin without a foundation, the floor would grow icy, the damp seeping upward until even the fire struggled to fight the chill. But inside a cabin raised on stone and timber, the cold could not climb so easily, and the warmth from the hearth spread evenly across the room, held by the insulation of air and the solid barrier beneath. In such conditions, every degree of warmth was precious, every small edge worth the effort it demanded, and the foundation became as important as any wall or roof beam. The men who ignored this step often paid the price quickly. Floors buckled under damp, gear mildewed, and boots left overnight froze, stiff with moisture drawn up from the earth. In contrast, those who built with foundations found that their shelters endured not just for one winter, but for many, standing firm even as storms battered them year after year. The stones resisted rot, the raised timbers stayed dry, and the cabin itself remained a reliable refuge in a land where reliability was the rarest treasure of all. Thus, what seemed to an outsider like unnecessary labor hauling rocks, leveling soil, shaping beams was, in truth, one of the most vital investments a mountain man could make. The earth might have appeared steady beneath his feet, but he knew it was a thief waiting to rob him of warmth. By elevating his shelter on stone and timber, he denied the ground its prize, holding the heat within and keeping the damp without. And in that small but crucial decision lay the quiet wisdom that spelled the difference between a home that gave life and one that slowly took it away. Raising a cabin in the wilderness was never a matter of haste. For the men who endured longest knew that the forest itself dictated the rhythm of construction, and that to take what nature offered at the wrong time was to build failure into the very bones of a shelter. Trees cut in the full flush of summer, swollen with sap and moisture, would betray their builders as the seasons changed, shrinking as they dried, cracking along their length and opening gaps wide enough for the mountain winds to slip through. Poles split to green wood, twist and warp stones laid without care for the frost, might shift with the heaving of the ground, and the whole structure, though it looked strong on the day it was finished, would slowly unravel under the weight of winter. The mountain men learned, through bitter experience and quiet observation, that survival depended not only on strength of arm, but on the patience to wait for the right season and the wisdom to prepare their materials as carefully as soldiers sharpen their blades before battle. The old hands would shake their heads at novices who rushed to fell trees as soon as a site was chosen, for they knew that good timber was more than straight trunks and sturdy grains, when taken in late autumn or during the frozen grip of winter, carried far less sap, its fibers tight and resilient, its shrinkage minimal when the deep cold arrived. Such logs, when seasoned properly, locked together as if used, holding their shape against storms that would pry lesser cabins apart. The process of seasoning was itself an art, requiring logs to be stripped, stacked off the ground, spaced so that the mountain air could draw moisture from them gradually. Rushing this step meant weakness, but patience rewarded the builder with timber that rang solid under the axe and fit tight when notched into place. Even smaller materials, those easily overlooked, were chosen and prepared with the same discipline. Branches for roofing, bark for layering, teals for rafters all had their seasons when they could be taken without spoiling. Grass cut too late lost its insulating strength. Clay dug from the wrong place cracked when the frost returned. And hides stretched at the wrong time would rot before they could serve their purpose. Each element carried its own quiet rules, and those who ignored them soon found themselves patching holes in the heart of winter, cursing the shortcuts that had cost them comfort, safety, or worse. In this way, construction became as much a dialogue with time as with the materials themselves. The men learned to think months ahead, preparing resources long before they were needed, stacking logs to dry through summer for cabins that would not rise, till the following year cutting grasses when they were strongest, storing clay where frost could not reach it. It was work that tested patience as much as skill, for in a world where every task demanded sweat and muscle, it was tempting to seize what was at hand and trust it would hold. But the mountain taught harsh lessons, and those who failed to respect its seasons often did not last to repeat their mistakes. Thus, behind every shelter that endured stood not only the labor of hands, but the discipline of restraint, the willingness to wait for the right moment, and the knowledge that wood stone and fiber, if taken too soon or used afresh, would betray the one who leaned on them. The cabins that survived were not just built of logs and clay. They were built of foresight, patience, and the deep understanding that the wilderness gave nothing freely, not even the materials with which to resist its fury. Among all the features of a mountain man's cabin, few were as deceptively simple, yet as vital as the chimney. For this was no mere channel to carry smoke away, but the very engine that determined how efficiently a fire's energy could be harnessed, how evenly its warmth could be spread, and how safely its flames could burn through long winter nights. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like nothing more than a stack of stones rising from the hearth, but to the men who depended on it, the chimney was a carefully designed system where every stone, every joint, and every angle carried meaning. The wilderness offered no second chances to those who wasted fuel or filled their shelters with choking smoke. And so, the art of chimney building became as refined in its own way as any craft of the civilized world. The challenge was straightforward to describe, yet difficult to master: how to draw smoke upward and out while keeping heat within. A poorly made chimney stole warmth, pulling it straight into the sky, leaving men to shiver beside a fire that burned their wood supply faster than they could replace it. At the same time, if the draft was not right, smoke would curl back into the room, blackening the air, stinging eyes, and making every breath an ordeal. The trappers and builders who lasted the longest learned to solve this puzzle with ingenious methods, crafting heat exchangers from stone, clay, and even shaped channels that captured heat before it escaped, radiating it back into the room long after the flames had died. One might picture an evening where the fire roars bright, sparks rising into the darkness of the chimney, but rather than losing that warmth, the stones built into the structure itself glow faintly as they absorb the heat, storing it like a reservoir. Hours later, when the flames have dwindled to embers, those same stones release their stored energy in slow waves, keeping the cabin warmer through the blackest parts of the night. This principle, though simple, turned a modest pile of fuel into a lifeline, reducing the endless labor of chopping and hauling wood, and giving weary men the chance to sleep without constant interruption. In a land where energy was measured in muscle and calories, the conservation of fuel was as important as the preservation of life itself. The chimneys also reflected a deep understanding of air currents. Builders experimented with flue shapes, adding curves and narrowing throats to control the draft, ensuring that smoke lifted away without stealing all the fire's heat. Some even placed flat stones in strategic spots so that hot air would be deflected downward and outward before it slipped through the opening. These were not refinements for comfort alone, but for survival, because the shelter, clouded with smoke, weakened its occupants as surely as hunger or frostbite. and a fire that consumed wood too quickly risked leaving them without fuel when storms made gathering impossible. It is remarkable to think that men armed with nothing more than axes, shovels, and their own ingenuity created heating systems that blended efficiency with necessity, shaping crude chimneys into tools as critical as rifles or traps. They had no formal diagrams, no texts to consult, only the collective wisdom earned from years of watching how smoke behaved, how stones held heat, how air moved in narrow spaces. And yet, through that wisdom, they built devices that turned their shelters into true bastions against the winter. Places where fire could be tended with less strain, where warmth lasted longer, and where breath came clear instead of through smoke-filled air. Thus, the chimney stood as both symbol and safeguard, the quiet reminder that survival was never about brute force alone, but about the intelligence to capture every advantage, to waste nothing, and to transform even the most fleeting flames into enduring allies against the cold. While the chimney carried the fire as breath upward, and its design determined how much warmth could be saved, it was the stones and clay within the cabin that gave the heat a body, transforming its fleeting flames into endurance that lasted through the longest nights. The mountain men discovered through years of necessity that earth itself could be persuaded to serve as a kind of storage chest for fire, energy soaking up the radiance while the blaze was strong and giving it back. Slowly, patiently, when the darkness deepened and the flames sank into embers, these walls of stone hearths lined with clay and even floors packed carefully with dense material acted as what we today might call heat batteries. But to the men who depended on them, they were simply another ally against a winter that never ceased pressing in. It is easy to underestimate the power of such a simple principle until one has felt it firsthand. Imagine sitting close to the hearth at twilight, watching the fire dance and crackle, knowing that in hours the logs will burn down to coals. Without stone to capture the warmth, the room would soon mirror the world outside, the cold reclaiming every corner, forcing a man to rise again and again to feed the flames. But when stones were placed with care, stacked around the fire, and even built into the walls, they began to glow invisibly with stored heat, their mass holding onto every spark's gift. Long after the fire had quieted, the stones would radiate a gentle warmth, steady and reliable, wrapping the shelter in comfort, even as the storm outside clawed at the walls with icy fingers. Clay played its part as well, not only sealing gaps in the log walls, but also lending its mass to the fight. Thick layers of packed earth around hearths or within chinking absorbed the day's energy, creating reservoirs that could be tapped through the night. This effect turned even modest fires into lasting sources of heat, reducing the burden of endless wood cutting and allowing exhausted men to rest more deeply, their bodies spared from the constant shivers that stole strength. It was a system that relied on patience and careful building rather than brute effort. And in the mountains, such conservation of labor often spelled the difference between survival and collapse. There were stories told of cabins where the builders had neglected this wisdom, where thin walls and bare floors let warmth vanish as quickly as it was made. Those men burned through their stores of wood twice as fast, spent endless hours venturing into the cold for more fuel, and still lay awake through nights that seemed determined to freeze them. In contrast, the shelters that embraced the use of stone and clay felt like fortresses, their walls alive with a subtle heat that gave endurance not only to the structure, but to the souls within. This practice of using thermal mass was not born from theory, but from lived necessity. It's from the sharp awareness that every calorie of heat mattered, and that wasting it was as deadly as wasting food. By treating stones and clay not as dead weight, but as living partners in the cycle of fire, the mountain men created a kind of silent, enduring warmth that asked for no tending once it was built, giving them not comfort, but time to sleep, time to recover, time to prepare for the trials that would always come with dawn. In this way, the earth itself became part of the defense, a reminder that survival was not only about fire burning brightly, but about how wisely its gift could be captured and carried into the endless night. Even with fire carefully tended, with stones and clay absorbing its gift, and with chimneys shaped to capture as much warmth as possible, there still remained the question of how to spread that heat in a way truly kept men alive through the blackest hours of the night. The mountain shelters, no matter how tightly sealed, were not vast halls, but close and simple rooms. And yet, even within their small spaces, warmth could gather, unevenly rising high, while the floor stayed bitterly cold, pooling near the hearth, while the corners froze. It was here that the mountain men leaned on the invisible hand of physics, though they would not have called it that, learning to arrange their shelters so that convection currents moved heat steadily through the air, and to lift their sleeping platforms off the ground where the cold was most merciless, to lie directly on the earthen floor of a cabin, no matter how strong the fire, was to invite frost to creep into one's bones. For the ground held chill like a sponge, drawing warmth from anybody foolish enough to rest against it. Even with furs and blankets, the cold pressed upward. And many who ignored this lesson found themselves waking in shivers, or worse, never waking at all. The survivors knew to raise their beds, sometimes by simple wooden frames, sometimes by platforms of logs layered with branches, and even by lofts built into the upper parts of their cabins. In these places, a sleeper could take advantage of the natural rise of heated air, letting the warmth that gathered near the roof wrap around them while the cold sank harmlessly below. Convection itself became an ally, though invisible and silent. Builders often positioned their hearths so that flames and heated stones created steady air currents, rising up and drawing cooler air toward the fire, setting in motion a cycle that, once begun, helped circulate warmth more evenly through the room. Its openings were left in just the right places to allow a gentle draw, and in some cabins, lofts were deliberately placed where the warmest air collected, ensuring that those who slept above rested in the most protected pocket of heat. It was a wisdom that came not from charts or numbers, but from years of observation, watching how smoke twisted in the air, feeling where warmth lingered, noticing where frost persisted, even when the fire had burned all day. This understanding of heat distribution may seem simple, but it was the product of necessity sharpened into skill. In conditions where a man's breath froze in his beard, where water turned solid overnight, and where even leather stiffened with cold, it was not enough to have a fire blazing. That heat had to be managed, shared, and directed if it was to sustain life. A cabin where the air was allowed to stagnate might have men huddled close to the flames while others shivered in the corners, but a cabin shaped to guide currents and fitted with raised beds became a place where warmth stretched further, where wood supplies lasted longer, and where men woke with enough strength to face another day. Thus, the craft of survival once again revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in subtle knowledge. In the decision to lift a bed a few feet higher, in the placement of a hearthstone, in the small adjustments that turned a shelter from a bare refuge into a true defense. The mountain men may not have spoken of convection or thermal layering, but they lived by its truth, and through it they wrestled every possible advantage from the harsh air around them, building not only shelters but systems that kept them alive when the mountains offered no mercy. No matter how well a cabin was built, no matter how cleverly its roof shed the snow, or how wisely its walls held the warmth, all of it depended on a resource as humble as it was essential: wood. Fire was the breath of life in the Rockies, and wood was the food that kept that fire alive, which meant that the gathering, storing, and guarding of fuel was not a chore to be done casually, but a discipline as vital as hunting or trapping. The mountain men learned quickly that storms could come without warning and last not for hours, but for days or even weeks, sealing the world in white and making the cutting of wood impossible. To be caught in such a storm with an empty pile was as deadly as being caught without food, for in the mountains, warmth and life were one and the same. The men who survived longest approached fuel as a form of wealth, measuring their security not in coins or goods, but in the stacks of split logs that rose outside their cabins, each one a promise that the fire would not falter. They cut in the months before winter with relentless determination, knowing that every armful gathered now was an hour of life spared later. Axes rang through the woods as trunks of pine and fir fell. And then came the endless labor of limbing, splitting, and stacking. These stacks were not left in careless heaps, but arranged carefully, raised off the ground to keep them dry, often covered with bark or brush so that snow and rain could not rot them. To pass a cabin with wood piled high was to know that the man within had prepared wisely. To see one with only a modest pile was to suspect that hardship, or worse, waited inside before spring returned. Imagine the sound of the wind shrieking through the trees, snow hurling itself against the roof, and the world outside swallowed in a white haze so dense that even a step beyond the door would risk being lost. In those moments, a man's survival depended on whether he could reach for a log without leaving the safety of his walls, whether his foresight in the autumn now paid its dividends. To run short of wood in such conditions meant venturing out into storms where the cold could take fingers in minutes and where exhaustion might drag him down into the snow, never to rise again. Every log stacked before winter became more than fuel lit was a shield against desperation. Fuel management also meant choosing wisely which wood to burn and when. Softwoods like pine ignited quickly and were perfect for sparking life into a morning fire, while heavier woods such as fir burned longer and steadier through the night. Even scraps, bark, and pine cones were saved. For nothing was wasted in a land where each fragment of fuel could mean the difference between shivering and resting in comfort. The mountain men became masters of stretching resources, feeding the flames just enough to sustain warmth without wasting wood. A delicate balance that required both discipline and constant attention. Thus, when one speaks of survival in the Rockies, it is not only about the strength of walls or the brilliance of design, but about the discipline of preparation. Firewood was survival in its most tangible form. Each cut log a deposit in a bank where the only currency was warmth. To neglect this work was to gamble recklessly with one's life, but to labor steadily, day after day, filling the stacks until they seemed endless, was to build a fortress not only of stone and timber, but of foresight. And in those endless winters was foresight more than anything else that marked the line between those who endured and those who did not. The finest stacks of firewood and the most carefully tended flames would mean little if the heat they produced slipped away through cracks in the walls. And so the mountain men gave as much thought to sealing their cabins as they did to feeding their hearts. The log walls, strong as they were, could never fit together perfectly. Each trunk curved subtly. Each joint left small gaps through which the breath of winter crept in. It's left unsealed. Those gaps became channels that funneled icy drafts into the heart of the room, undoing the work of both fire and stone in a matter of minutes. The wilderness offered no rolls of insulation, no sheets of glass or metal. And so the men turned instead to what nature placed at their feet: clay from riverbanks, grasses cut from summer meadows, and even animal hair collected from hides. These humble materials, pressed into the cracks and packed with care, turned a rough log structure into a fortress of warmth. The work of sealing, known among builders as chinking, was slow and meticulous. A man, crouched with frozen fingers, pressing handfuls of clay into seams, wedging tufts of dried grass to hold it firm. Sometimes mixing in the coarse hair of bison or deer for added binding strength. As he worked, he thought not of comfort, but of survival. For every crevice filled was one less avenue for the cold to steal his life. Once dried, the mixture hardened into a natural barrier that resisted both wind and moisture, creating invisible shields between the cabin's interior and the world beyond. It was never flawless. New cracks opened with shifting timbers, storms washed away weak spots, and constant repairs were required. but each patch added hours of precious warmth to the nights. Imagine sitting by the fire on a night when the wind outside roared like a living thing. In a poorly sealed cabin, the flames would bend and flicker, pulled by drafts from unseen gaps, the warmth vanishing almost as quickly as it was made. But in the cabin, well chinked, the fire burned steady, its heat collecting against walls that no longer leaked, spreading evenly through the room. In such a place, a man could close his eyes and rest, knowing that his work with clay and grass earlier in the season now repaid him with comfort and safety. The beauty of this practice lay in its simplicity and its reliance on resources always close at hand. A riverbank provided clay in abundance. Meadows offered grass toughened by the sun. The hides of animals yielded hair that might otherwise have been discarded. Together, these formed a kind of living skin for the cabin, one that required no tools beyond hands and patience, and yet made the difference between a structure that merely stood and one that truly protected. Those who neglected their chinking soon learned the cost, shivering as their fires devoured precious wood to fight drafts that could have been blocked with a few hours' labor. Those who respected the task found their cabins transformed, not into luxuries, but into reliable sanctuaries where the warmth stayed where it belonged. And so it was that the mountain men, with no materials beyond what the earth and animals offered, discovered how to weave nature itself into their walls, creating barriers that, though rough in appearance, carried the quiet genius of survival. Even with walls sealed tight against the wind, with chimneys drawing clean and strong, and with firewood stacked high for the storms, the nights in the Rockies could still press in with a cold so merciless it seemed to breathe through the very air. In such darkness, when the fire dwindled to embers and men lay wrapped in their furs, the cold crept closer, seeping into bones and stealing rest inch by inch. To combat this silent thief, the mountain men turned to one of the oldest tricks known to those who lived close to the earth: the use of heated stones as radiant companions, small reservoirs of warmth that carried the fire's gift long after the flames themselves had died. The practice was simple in appearance, but profound in effect. Near the evening fire, flat stones were carefully chosen, warmed slowly in the heart of the coals until they held heat deep within their cores. These were not tossed carelessly into beds, for a stone too hot could scorch or split from sudden cooling. Instead, they were wrapped in cloth or tucked into pouches of hideband, slipped beneath bedding, or placed at the foot of a sleeping platform. As the night wore on and the fire sank low, those stones released their warmth in gentle waves, chasing away the frost that gathered in corners and providing comfort that no fur alone could match. For the weary trapper, the glow of that hidden heat was as precious as any treasure, a silent guardian through hours when the cold pressed hardest. One can imagine the relief of curling beside such a stone after a day spent in snow to the waist, hands stiff from axe work, face stung raw by the wind. To slide beneath blankets and feel that unexpected warmth radiating upward was to taste a luxury almost unimaginable in such a brutal setting. The stones did not flare or spark. They asked for no tending once placed. They simply gave back what they had taken in, serving as quiet allies against the night. In a land where every moment of rest was vital, where exhaustion could mean mistakes, and mistakes could mean death, such comfort was more than convenience. It was preservation. There were rules, of course, born from experience. Stones gathered from riverbeds were avoided, for trapped moisture could cause them to crack or even burst when heated. Flatter stones were preferred, their broad surfaces holding warmth more evenly. The men often rotated them, heating some while others cooled, creating a cycle of warmth that extended far beyond the fire's immediate reach. It was a method so effective that even when the fire was allowed to dwindle deliberately to conserve wood, the shelter remained habitable, its occupants able to sleep through the deepest hours of winter without the endless interruptions of rising to feed the flames. Such ingenuity speaks to the essence of survival in the Rockies. It was never about brute force alone, but about learning how to stretch every resource to its limit, how to coax warmth from stone, light from embers, and comfort from the smallest advantage. To modernize, the idea of sleeping beside a rock might seem crude, yet for those men it was a lifeline, proof that even in a land designed to break the human spirit, cleverness could carve out a pocket of warmth. And in the long silence of the mountain night, when the storm howled outside and the fire's glow faded, it was the steady radiance of those stones that made the difference between shivering in misery and resting in strength for the trials of the coming dawn. Though the cabins of the mountain men stood sturdy with their thick walls, sealed seams, and carefully laid roofs, no builder could ever assume his work was finished. For the mountains had a way of testing every weakness, and what seemed strong one day could be undone by a single storm the next. Weatherproofing was not a single task completed at the end of construction, but a continual battle, a vigilance that demanded both patience and discipline, because the elements were relentless in their search for flaws. Wind sought out the smallest cracks to pry wider, rain worked its way between seams, and melting snow dripped through the tiniest faults until a slow leak became a torrent. A cabin that was not guarded against these assaults became a trap filling with moisture that invited rot spreading, damp that sapped heat from every corner and turning a hard-built refuge into a place as dangerous as the open air. The men who survived longest understood that tight log fitting was the first line of defense. Each log had to be notched with precision, pressed against its neighbor so firmly that even the whistling wind could find no purchase. This demanded skill as much as labor, for uneven logs left gaps that no amount of later patching could entirely mend. Once stacked, the work did not stop, for every storm might shift a beam or settle a joint, and those changes had to be watched constantly, inspected with a keen eye before they grew into true dangers. Roofs, too, were never left to chance, layered with bark, split shakes, or whatever material could be scavenged. They were anchored to shed water and snow, but always the builder knew that time and weather conspired to loosen them. After every heavy fall or sudden thaw, the wise man checked his roof, pressing down loose pieces, adding fresh layers, and making sure that no drip could find its way inside. Imagine the despair of waking in the middle of the night to feel a cold drop strike your face, to find your bedding soaked, your firewood damp, and your hard-earned warmth bleeding away through an unseen fault. Such moments taught lessons that were not forgotten. Vigilance was survival. A single leak left untended might rot the floor, soak supplies, and undo weeks of labor in hours. But a cabin maintained with diligence, inspected after every storm, patched with fresh clay, reinforced with bark and grass, became a fortress against the weather, standing strong even as the storms screamed outside. The labor was constant, and it demanded humility. No man could boast that his shelter was beyond the reach of nature, for the mountains humbled all alike. Instead, the wise admitted that weatherproofing was never finished, that each day brought new tasks, sealing a gap here, placing a layer there, listening for the whistle of wind in corners where silence should have been. It was a routine as necessary as tending the fire, for just as flames could die without fuel, so could a cabin fail without care. Thus, the story of weatherproofing was not one of perfection, but of persistence. The cabins that lasted were not flawless creations, immune to the elements. They were shelters, tended like living things, strengthened each day by the attention of the men within. And in this ceaseless struggle, the mountain men revealed again the secret of their survival. Not that they conquered the wilderness, but that they never ceased adapting to it, closing each breach as it came, guarding against each intrusion, and through that vigilance, carving a fragile but enduring island of safety in a land designed to break the unprepared. If weatherproofing demanded constant vigilance, then moisture management was the hidden battle that never truly ended. For water was a quiet adversary that seeped into every weakness, and once inside, it could undo months of careful labor. The mountain men feared dampness as much as they feared hunger or frost, 'cause a wet shelter was more than uncomfortably lit, was deadly. Moisture crept into bedding and clothing until they no longer offered warmth. It rotted timbers from within until walls lost their strength, and it turned provisions into spoiled waste. A cabin that allowed water to settle in its corners became a coffin slowly filling with cold, where hypothermia could take hold, not in hours of exposure, but in the supposed safety of the home itself. The ground was the first accomplice of this enemy, drawing frost upward and sweating cold into floors that had not been raised properly. Men who slept too close to such dampness woke shivering, their blankets heavy with dew, their energy drained by the unrelenting chill. Even firewood stored carelessly near moisture betrayed them, refusing to burn or producing only smoky, weak flames. The loss was twofold: comfort and resources vanished together, and what fuel remained could not be relied upon in the moments it was most needed. To guard against this, the survivors kept their supplies dry as zealously as they guarded their rifles, building platforms and racks, covering their stacks with bark and hides, and checking daily that nothing had grown soft or slick with water. Moisture's danger extended beyond the immediate. Rot set into beams that had once been strong, spreading invisibly until the structure sagged. Leather gear warped, stitching dissolved, powder from muskets clumped and became useless. A man could spend an entire season gathering food, tanning hides, or shaping tools, only to see his work undone because water found its way where it did not belong. Thus, a watchful eye was turned not only to storms, but to the slow melting of snow near spring, to the trickle of thaw seeping under walls, to condensation forming on cold surfaces inside the shelter. Every drop mattered, every trace of dampness seen as a warning that demanded action before it grew into a threat. The wise treated dryness as a treasure. Bedding was aired when the rare sun appeared. Clothing hung close to fires without letting sparks take them, and food stores were placed in containers raised above the ground. Some men even used heated stones, not only to warm themselves, but to drive dampness from their clothes. Understanding that to sleep in wet garments was as dangerous as sleeping outside in the snow, they learned that hypothermia did not announce itself loudly, crept in through damp fur, through soaked boots, through chilled blankets, sapping strength so subtly that a man often realized too late what was happening. Moisture management, then, was not a separate task, but a constant habit woven into the rhythm of daily survival. It was the reason men inspected their shelters after storms, the reason they stacked wood high and dry, the reason they treated every drip as a warning sign. For in the silence of the mountains, the cold could kill swiftly, but dampness killed slowly, with rot and exhaustion, undermining the very tools meant to preserve life. To stay dry was to stay alive, and the mountain men who endured longest understood this truth better than most. Water was life when drunk, but water within a cabin was death waiting patiently for its hour. Yet even when the walls were sealed, the roof layered, and every drop of moisture held at bay, a danger remained that was invisible, silent, and more insidious than the cold itself: the air inside the cabin. The fire that kept men alive consumed oxygen with every flicker, and without a steady exchange of fresh air, the very lifeline of warmth could turn into a poison. Smoke, invisible gases, and the creeping presence of carbon monoxide gathered when ventilation was poor, and a man who lay down to rest in such a cabin might never open his eyes again. It was this truth that forced the mountain men to think not only of holding warmth in, but of letting air move freely, balancing comfort with survival in a delicate equation that demanded just as much wisdom as choosing logs or cutting wood. Their ventilation systems were not elaborate machines, but practical solutions shaped by observation and necessity. Chimneys were designed not only to draw smoke upward, but also to pull in a subtle draft of clean air from vents carved low in the walls or gaps left deliberately near doors. Openings, though small, were placed with care, allowing enough movement of air to feed the fire and refresh the cabin without surrendering all of its hard-won warmth. Sometimes shutters of hide or wood were crafted to cover these gaps, opened slightly when the fire burned brightest, closed when the night grew bitter. Each adjustment made with a practiced hand that understood how fragile the balance could be. Imagine sitting inside a cabin in midwinter, the fire glowing strong, the warmth holding steady. To an inexperienced eye, the urge might be to seal every crack, to lock out the cold completely. But the mountain men knew better. To tight a seal, and the air would grow thick, smoke clinging low to the ceiling, eyes burning, lungs aching. Too little fresh air and an invisible danger would slip in, robbing strength and clarity until sleep claimed the body permanently. The experienced trappers accepted the paradox that to survive the cold, one had to invite a small measure of it inside, to trade a fraction of warmth for the certainty of breath. This principle turned ventilation into an ongoing act of vigilance. Men checked away smoke curled in the rafters, adjusted shutters when flames grew sluggish, and listened to the faint whistle of air at night as a sign that their cabin was breathing as it should. Some even built small loft vents, allowing stale air to rise and escape while cooler drafts slipped in low, ensuring a natural circulation that mirrored the flows of the mountain winds outside. These were not luxuries, but necessities, for every cabin that ignored them became a trap waiting for its moment to close. The genius of these systems lay not in their complexity, but in their simplicity, in the way they turned crude tools and natural materials into safeguards against dangers few could see. The mountain men may not have spoken of carbon monoxide or airflow in scientific terms, yet they understood the truth as clearly as any modern builder. A shelter without breath was a coffin, no matter how warm its fire burned. And so their cabins, humble as they appeared, were not only fortresses against the cold, but lungs that breathed with the men inside, sustaining them through the endless storms and giving them another dawn in a land where each dawn was a victory. While walls, chimneys, and roofs formed the body of a mountain man's cabin, the doors and windows were its vulnerable joints, the places where weakness most often showed itself, and where the cold pressed hardest to force its way inside. A door poorly fitted or a window left unsealed could undo the work of days, turning a warm refuge into a drafty trap where the fire struggled endlessly against the invading air. The men who built to survive understood this with absolute clarity, and so they treated these openings not as afterthoughts, but as critical points of defense, reinforcing and sealing them until they held as firmly as any log or stone. Doors were made not as decorative entries, but as barriers, crafted thick from solid planks or slabs of hewn timber, their weight adding both strength and insulation. They were hung low and tight, sometimes with an extra lip carved at the bottom to press firmly against the threshold, a simple design that prevented wind from creeping underneath. To further guard against drafts, hides or heavy blankets were often hung behind the door, layering protection so that even if cold seeped through the cracks, it was trapped before it reached the room beyond. These layers also muffled the roar of storms, turning the sound of the blizzard into a distant echo rather than a force that seemed ready to push the cabin inward. Windows, if they existed at all, were rarely more than small openings covered with oiled hides, greased paper, or thin slabs of translucent horn, materials chosen not for clarity, but for their ability to block wind and hold heat. Any larger aperture would have been folly, for glass was a luxury unknown in the wilderness, and the men valued warmth over light. The frames of these openings were sealed with clay and moss, inspected after each storm to make sure no fissure had opened, for even the narrowest crack could become a funnel for icy drafts. At night, shutters of wood were dropped across them, or blankets were tacked over, further layering insulation so that the warmth produced by fire and stone remained trapped inside. To step into a well-built cabin on a winter night was to feel the difference immediately. In shelters where doors rattled and windows leaked, The fire bent and hissed as invisible streams of air rushed through, forcing men to huddle close to the flames and burn through wood far too quickly. But in those cabins where every seam was guarded, where the door fit like a seal, and windows were barricaded with care, the fire seemed to glow brighter, its heat filling the room evenly, its strength lasting longer. The men inside could stretch out their wearied bodies without fear of icy drafts creeping under blankets, knowing that their fortress was holding firm. It was painstaking work, this constant reinforcing and sealing, for every storm tested the joints anew, shifting timbers, warping planks, and straining shutters. Yet, those who endured knew that the effort was never wasted. In the mountains, it was not only the broad walls or the massive roof that saved a man's life, but also the smallest details at the weakest points. And so the doors and windows of a mountain man's cabin stood as proof that survival was built not only on strength, but on diligence, the knowledge that even the humblest seam could decide whether warmth stayed in or the cold crept through. Keeping a cabin standing through the long, Rocky Mountain winters was never as simple as finishing its construction and stepping inside to safety. The work of survival did not end when the last log was laid or the final seam was sealed. It carried on every single day, woven into the rhythm of life like eating or breathing. The mountain men understood that what shifted, stones settled, and storms revealed weaknesses no builder could anticipate. What seemed sturdy in October might, by January, be tested to breaking by the weight of snow or the lash of icy winds. For this reason, maintenance and repair became as constant a routine as cutting wood or tending the fire, 'cause they knew too well that even the smallest crack left untended could widen into a draft that stole warmth or a leak that soaked bedding until the cold claimed the exhausted body lying there. Inspections were not luxuries, but necessities. Each morning and evening of practice I swept across the cabin, tailing the telltale signs of trouble, the faint whistle of air where none should be, a dark line of damp creeping across the ceiling, a sagging timber that hinted at too much weight pressing from above, clay packed between logs, dried and crumbled, needing to be pressed anew. Bark layers on the roof shifted with the wind and had to be reset. Doors and shutters swelled or shrank with moisture and frost, demanding adjustments before they warped beyond use. These were not repairs to be put off until a convenient time, for the mountains offered no grace for delay. A man who ignored a small flaw often found it magnified by the storm, the damage doubling or tripling until it threatened the very life of the shelter. Picture the weariness of a trapper at the end of a day spent trudging through waist-deep snow, returning with numb hands and aching legs, only to find that his evening was not yet his own. He still had to kneel beside the wall and press new clay into widening gaps, climb onto the roof in biting wind to fasten loose shingles or reset stones that had shifted at the hearth. It was exhausting work, piled upon exhaustion, but he did it because he knew that to rest without repairing was to gamble with his life. Many stories were told of men who chose to ignore a crack or a drip, convincing themselves it was small enough to endure. Too often, those stories ended in tragedy, with frost-bitten fingers, rotted supplies, or worse, the cabin collapsed in silence under snow. The cabins that endured were not those built perfectly from the start, but those cared for relentlessly. Each patch of clay, each reset log, each mended seam represented not only labor, but foresight. In that endless cycle of maintenance, the mountain men showed a discipline that was born not of pride, but of fear. The clear knowledge that the wilderness tolerated no complacency. To wake and find your roof intact, your firewood dry, and your bed unsoaked was not luck, it was the reward for every small repair made in days past. In this way, maintenance and repair became almost a ritual of respect for the mountains themselves. The men understood they were not building monuments to stand forever, but fragile fortresses that needed constant care to withstand the ceaseless assault of snow, wind, and water. And so they checked, patched, mended, and rebuilt again and again until each day blurred into the next. It was this quiet, unending labor done without glory, done without pause, that kept them alive when nature tested every weakness, proving once more that in the Rockies, survival was never a single act, but a discipline practiced daily. For all their care in building, sealing, and repairing, the mountain men carried in their minds a grim certainty. No shelter, however strong, was beyond failure. A roof might collapse beneath a storm, heavier than any remembered. A chimney might crack and scatter sparks into the walls, or a sudden flood from melting snow might rise faster than a man could prepare. The wilderness gave no guarantees, and so those who endured longest learned to live with contingency plans always ready. Emergency protocols meant not for convenience, but for survival when the unthinkable happened. These measures were born not from imagination, but from bitter tales of cabins lost, of men forced into desperate measures, and of lives saved by the foresight to plan for the worst. The first and most essential of these was backup heating. Fires could fail smothered by damp wood, robbed of draft by faulty chimneys, or doused by leaks in the roof. In such cases, men turned to alternate sources: fat-soaked torches made from strips of hide, small braziers fashioned of clay, or even stones heated in the last glow of the dying hearth, and then wrapped tightly to hold what warmth they could. These secondary methods were not meant to provide comfort, but to buy time, to hold off the creeping cold long enough to repair the fire or retreat to another plan. To ignore this precaution was to risk waking in darkness with no heat at all, a situation from which few walked away. Beyond this, the men understood that sometimes walls themselves could not be trusted, and so they prepared for the possibility of abandoning the cabin entirely. Body heat shelters were among the simplest and oldest techniques. Men pressed close together, wrapped in furs, conserving warmth not by flame, but by sharing the heat of their own flesh. It was a crude method, but in nights when firewood was gone or flames refused to rise, it kept life within the circle of breathing companions. Pride had no place in such measures. Survival demanded the setting aside of discomfort or modesty, for the choice was stark sheer heat or lose it forever. When even this was not enough, the mountains themselves offered a final refuge: the snow cave. At first glance, it seemed madness to crawl into the very substance that had driven them to such desperation. Yet those who had tried and survived knew that snow, shaped carefully, could insulate as well as suffocate. Dug into drifts and reinforced with branches, snow caves trapped the small warmth of breath and bodies, turning an enemy into an ally. These shelters were not comfortable, nor were they safe for long, but they gave men a chance when cabins failed or when storms pinned them too far from home. More than one life was carried into spring by the choice to dig quickly rather than freeze slowly. Such protocols were never spoken of lightly, for they acknowledged the fragility of every plan and the reality that nature often held the upper hand. Yet, by preparing for the collapse of their shelters, the mountain men proved again the resilience that defined them. They built, they repaired, they fortified, but they also carried within them the humility to know that failure was always near, and the ingenuity to survive, even when it came. In the end, these emergency measures stood as proof of the greatest lesson of all. Survival in the Rockies did not belong to those who trusted only in their strength, but to those who prepared for every weakness, even the collapse of the very walls meant to protect them. When storms dragged on longer than memory, when snow sealed the forest and every familiar path to the woodpile vanished beneath drifts taller than a man, even the most carefully stockpiled reserves of firewood could dwindle to nothing. In those moments, the mountain men found themselves forced into choices they would never have considered in gentler times. Fire was not negotiably, was life itself, and, when the logs were gone, improvisation became the only path forward. Anything that could catch a spark, smolder, or throw even a thin ribbon of heat into the air was pressed into service. Bark stripped from fallen trunks, pine cones gathered in pockets and pouches, scraps of old rope or rawhide. Even the handles of tools, once considered indispensable, were sacrificed to keep flames alive a little longer. To stand in a cabin with nothing left but embers fading to ash was to feel the press of panic against the ribs. For every minute without heat allowed the cold to creep deeper into the bones. It was in these hours that a man's ingenuity was tested most severely. Pine bark, once dismissed as waste, became a lifeline. Its resinous fibers caught quickly, sending up a sharp smoke but giving a sudden burst of flame that bought time to arrange the next piece of fuel. Pine cones, small and unassuming, revealed their hidden worth by burning with surprising vigor. Their packed scales flaring brightly before collapsing into glowing coals. Even scraps of furniture or tool handles, carved carefully away with regret, gave enough heat to restart the cycle of survival. Such measures were never taken lightly, for each improvised fuel carried its own cost. The handle of an axe might save a night, but leave the tool useless come morning, endangering the ability to cut wood once the storm passed. Bark stripped too aggressively left trees weakened, sometimes killing them outright, reducing future supplies. Even burning hides or scraps of cloth was a gamble, filling the cabin with choking smoke that could drive men coughing to the brink of suffocation. Yet, in the calculus of survival, these sacrifices were accepted because the alternative was to let the fire die, and with it, the fragile barrier between life and the freezing void beyond the walls. Imagine the bitter irony of holding a fine rifle in one hand, trapline ready for spring in the other, and realizing that none of it mattered if the fire went out that night. The value of possessions inverted in the face of desperation for what was once a tool or a treasure became kindling. Its worth measured only in how much longer it could keep the flames alive. And in that flickering light, men learned again and again that survival was not about comfort or pride, but about making the hard choices that meant one more sunrise. Fuel improvisation was a practice born from crisis, but it carried with it the same lesson as every other skill the mountain men mastered. Waste nothing, overlook nothing, and always see the hidden potential in what lies around you. When the storms finally broke and the woodcutting could begin anew, the survivors often looked at their stripped cabins, their shortened tools, their spent stores, and understood the truth that every sacrifice had been worth it, because each one had bought them the most precious commodity of all, another day alive in a land that offered no forgiveness. Just as a fire could flicker out when wood ran low, so too could strength vanish when food supplies dwindled, and in the Rockies, the hunt was not always reliable. The storms came without warning, rivers froze solid, and the forests fell silent. Their animals vanished into hidden dens. Traps that once yielded fur and flesh returned empty, and rifles fired into empty snowfields brought nothing but echoes. The mountain men knew this well, and so they never trusted the present hunt alone. They stored food with the same care they cut wood or sealed their cabins, creating hidden reserves of nourishment meant not for daily feasting, but for the bleak nights when hunger pressed hardest and no other options remained. The most trusted provision was pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, pounded fine, blended with rendered fat, and often laced with berries for both flavor and added sustenance. It was dense, compact, and astonishingly durable, able to last for months without spoiling, even through the wild swings of mountain weather. A handful of pemmican could keep a man on his feet for a full day's work, and though it was no luxury meal, it was a treasure in the darkest weeks of winter. Alongside, it was jerky, strips of meat dried in smoke or sun until every trace of moisture was drawn away. Though tougher to chew, it carried the gift of preservation, providing protein long after fresh hunting became impossible. And for moments when the body cried out, not just for meat, but for balance, dry berries were brought from autumn harvests, their sweetness a reminder of warmer days and their nutrients, a safeguard against weakness. These stores were never consumed casually. Each piece was measured, rationed, and considered against the uncertain days ahead. To eat a strip of jerky without thought was a gamble that tomorrow's traps would succeed. To open a sack of pemmican too soon was to risk starvation if storms dragged on longer than expected. The mountain men treated their food reserves with reverence, for they knew each bite carried with it the weight of choices yet to be made. Supplies were hidden carefully, often in raised caches built of stone or wood to keep them from moisture and scavengers. Bears, wolves, and even smaller creatures like mice and martens posed constant threats to stored provisions. And losing a cache to hungry claws could be as devastating as losing a roof in a storm. The importance of storage was not only in having food, but in knowing it would be there when everything else failed. Imagine the despair of returning from an empty trapline to find that the stores themselves had spoiled or been stolen by animals. To guard against such losses, many mountain men prepared multiple caches, spreading their reserves across locations so that one failure did not end in ruin. It was a strategy born of experience and sharpened by necessity. A reminder that survival demanded planning far beyond the present moment. And so the shelves of jerky, the sacks of dried berries, the carefully pressed cakes of pemmican became more than food. They became the promise of endurance. The assurance that when storms silenced the forests and rivers, when rifles and traps brought nothing home, there would still be something to keep strength alive. In that foresight lay the margin between survival and tragedy. For in the Rockies, a man without fire might endure a night, but a man without food could not endure the season. Food alone could not sustain the mountain men through the long winters, for thirst was an adversary as dangerous as hunger or cold. Streams froze solid, rivers lay hidden beneath thick sheets of ice, and the familiar trickle of springs was buried deep under snowdrifts. In those months, the only reliable source of water was the very snow that blanketed the land. Yet even this gift of nature required caution and knowledge, because melting snow improperly wasted precious fuel and sometimes left men weaker rather than stronger. The veterans of the mountains understood that survival meant knowing not only how to gather water, but how to coax it from snow with efficiency and care. The unwise might toss handfuls of snow directly into a pot over the fire, expecting it to melt into drinkable water. But they soon learned that snow's airy bulk devoured heat far faster than it yielded liquid. A canna packed with snow would sit stubbornly above the flames, wasting wood and fat while providing little more than a thin layer of lukewarm slush. Worse still, those who ate snow directly, in desperation or ignorance, only cooled their bodies further, bringing on chills and exhaustion that could lead swiftly to collapse. The mountain men had no tolerance for such mistakes. They knew the correct way was always to begin with a base of liquid water, however small, before adding snow in slow, steady increments, allowing each layer to melt into the base before more was introduced. This method turned a futile struggle into a manageable process. The small reserve of liquid water absorbed the cold of the snow and passed the heat along, melting the mass more quickly and using far less fuel. It was a principle that became second nature to the experienced. One of those details that seemed trivial to outsiders, but which spelled the difference between survival and waste in the harshest storms. Each cup of water boiled from snow carried within it the careful calculation of fuel consumed versus strength gained, for firewood and fat were limited, and squandering them on poorly melted snow could mean a man went thirsty tomorrow, even if he drank his fill today. The act itself became almost ritualistic. A kettle was set at the edge of the fire, not in the hottest part of the flames, but where the heat was steady. A little liquid water, saved carefully from earlier, was poured in. Then, handful by handful, the snow was pressed down, its crystalline whiteness surrendering slowly into clear water. Now and then the pot was stirred, steam rising with a hiss, until finally a full kettle of water was ready to drink, to cook with, or to refill skins in canteens. The process demanded patience, but in that patience lay safety. For every drop gained without waste meant another day carried forward. In truth, melting snow was more than a chorette, was another lesson in humility before the mountains. It reminded the men that even abundance could become a trap if approached without wisdom. That survival did not belong to those who acted in haste, but to those who respected the limits of their resources. To turn snow into water was to turn cold into life, but only if one remembered that fire was precious, time was fragile, and every mistake was paid for in sweat, hunger, or worse. And so the mountain men melted snow not as children playing with fire, but as craftsmen shaping survival itself. Drop by drop, flame by flame, in a land that never forgave waste, while food, water, and firewood sustained the body. The mountain men knew that another struggle, often quieter but just as perilous, unfolded within the mind. The endless isolation of the Rockies, where winter storms sealed valleys in silence and weeks passed without a human voice, carried its own danger, what some came to call winter madness. The body could endure hunger, thirst, or frost with enough preparation, but the mind, left too long in solitude, often faltered. Men who had built cabins sturdy enough to withstand blizzards and stored food enough to last until spring sometimes, lost themselves to loneliness, despair, or the haunting echo of their own thoughts. The long night stretched endlessly, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind pressing against the walls. With snow piled high outside and hunting impossible, time itself became a burden. Some men spoke to the fire as if it were a companion, or to the carved figures in crude drawings they scratched onto logs. Others recited prayers or sang old songs until their voices cracked, clinging to memory as a lifeline. A few kept journals, scratching words into rough, leather-bound books, not for posterity, but simply to hear their own thoughts take shape in a world otherwise silent. These small rituals were not luxuries, they were defenses, weapons against the creeping emptiness that threatened to unmoor the spirit. Isolation was felt most sharply during storms, when the cabin shook with wind and the snow howled outside like a living thing. Days might pass without sunlight, the world beyond reduced to a dim blur through shuttered windows. In such conditions, even the strongest men could feel the weight of despair pressing on their shoulders. It was not unusual for them to imagine voices in the storm, to feel watched by the dark woods, or to lose track of days entirely. For some, the silence became so overwhelming, it pressed louder than any noise, filling the cabin with a suffocating stillness that made even the act of breathing feel heavy. The men who survived longest were those who found ways to anchor themselves. Some carved tools, repaired gear, or practiced crafts that gave shape to the hours. Others repeated stories from memory, retelling tales of home, childhood, or hunts from years past, reminding themselves they were still connected to a greater world. Companionship, when it was available, was a shield beyond price to men. Sharing the burden of silence could keep one another tethered, their conversations holding madness at bay. Yet, even alone, the wise understood that the mind required tending just as the fire did, that neglecting it was as dangerous as letting wood run out on a freezing night. Ecological survival, then, was not an afterthought, but a discipline. The Rockies tested not only muscle and skill, but resilience of spirit. To emerge from a winter with body intact but mind broken was no survival at all, for a man without reason was as lost as one without shelter. The stories of winter madness served as warnings, passed quietly from one trapper to the next. Reminders that vigilance of the mind mattered as much as vigilance of the hearth. And so, in the dark heart of the wilderness, survival meant more than holding warmth in the body, meant guarding the fragile flame of thought itself, keeping it alive through silence, solitude, and the endless nights of winter. Though the storms howled outside and the fire offered its flickering promise of warmth, the mountain men knew that survival demanded more than full bellies and solid walls. The mind, as fragile as it was fierce, required tending just as carefully as any hearth. Left idle, it could turn inward, breeding despair, hallucination, or the creeping onset of winter madness. Yet those who endured long winters discovered that discipline of thought was as vital as discipline of hand, and so they crafted rituals, small and steady, to keep their spirits anchored against the weight of silence and isolation. Journaling became one of the most trusted companions, with ink when it was available, or with charcoal and scraps of hide when it was not. Men pressed their thoughts into words, shaping the endless monotony of days into something tangible. They recorded the weather, the progress of storms, the number of traps checked, or the weight of supplies consumed. But beyond these practical notes lay something deeper. The act of writing itself gave shape to memory and emotion, proof that they were still human in a wilderness designed to strip man down to mere survival. Each entry was a conversation with the self, a reminder that they existed not only as bodies enduring the cold, but as minds capable of reflection, humor, and even hope. Carving served a similar purpose, with knives honed on whetstones and scraps of wood scavenged from the forest. Men shaped crude figures, cool handles decorated with patterns, or small trinkets that carried no purpose beyond occupying the hands and steadying the thoughts. The rhythm of the blade against the grain gave order to time, each curl of wood falling like a measure of patience. Some carved animals remembered from the hunt, others symbols from distant homelands, their small creations becoming both distraction and anchor. A man who carved was not a prisoner of the storm, but a craftsman practicing his art. However humble, transforming the idle hours into something shaped by choice rather than despair. Storytelling, too, was vital, whether shared with a companion across the cabin or spoken aloud into the empty air. Old tales from childhood, legends passed along trade routes, or even accounts of hunts retold for the 100th time. These stories reminded men that they were part of a larger narrative, threads woven into the vast tapestry of human experience. To speak a story aloud was to fill the silence, to push back against the emptiness pressing at the walls. For some, these tales became nightly rituals, spoken softly to the flames as though the fire itself were a friend listening in the darkness. Perhaps most important of all were routines, the structured habits that turned endless, shapeless days into something ordered. Rising at the same hour, tending to the fire, mending gear, preparing meals, inspecting the cabin, and setting aside time for writing or carving. These rhythms were not merely chores, but lifelines. Routines imposed a sense of control in a land where control was nearly impossible. They kept the mind from wandering into despair, anchoring thought to action, and ensuring that every day felt distinct from the one before, even when the snow outside made them indistinguishable. In the end, these small practices, journaling, carving, storytelling, routines, were more than pastimes. They were acts of resistance against the wilderness itself, proof that men could preserve not only their bodies, but their humanity in a place that sought to erase it. Through these rituals, the mountain men reminded themselves that survival was not simply about lasting another night, but about protecting the fragile thread of the mind, weaving meaning into days otherwise lost to snow and silence. Even with journals, to steady the mind, and routines to guard against despair, there remained an undeniable truth that no man could ignore. In the vast loneliness of the Rockies, survival was stronger when shared. Companionship might not always be possible in the deep of winter, but communication, fragile, primitive, and often improvised, became a lifeline that stretched across valleys and forests, binding men together in a web of mutual aid. No matter how skilled, no matter how resourceful, the mountain man who believed he could face every crisis alone often found himself broken by the first true emergency. For this reason, systems of signaling and rendezvous were devised, creating invisible threads of connection across the wilderness. Smoke signals were among the oldest and most enduring forms, borrowed from native traditions and adapted to the trapper's own needs. A column of smoke rising in the stillness of a winter sky spoke louder than any shouted word, carrying its message across miles where voices could never reach. The pattern of puffs, the steadiness of the plume, even the color of the smoke conveyed meaning to those who had agreed on their codes beforehand. A thin, wavering trail might signal distress, while a steady column could mark safety or location. In this way, men scattered across hunting grounds or winter camps could remain aware of one another's presence, knowing that help, warning, or guidance might be no farther than the next ridge. Equally important were rendezvous points, agreed upon in advance with precision. For in a land where paths vanished beneath snow and landmarks disappeared into blizzards, chance meetings could not be trusted. These were often chosen near prominent features, an isolated boulder, a grove of pines, or a bend in a river, and served as gathering places in times of need. A man cut off by storm or forced from his cabin might trek miles through snow, guided only by memory and instinct to reach one of these points where the hope of aid and companionship outweighed the misery of the journey. At times, small caches of supplies were left at such places as well-dried meat, spare flints, or hide tokens of mutual trust that might save an unseen friend's life in desperate hours. Such systems were not infallible, but they carried with them the reassurance that a man was never wholly alone, even in the deepest valley or the highest pass. To know that a signal might be seen, that a rendezvous might bring another human face, was enough to push back against despair and to renew the will to fight another day. Stories were told of men saved by the faint sight of a smoke plume on the horizon, of others who stumbled half-frozen into a rendezvous grove and found food and warmth waiting, proof of the quiet brotherhood that bound those who lived in the mountains. In the grand silence of the Rockies, these crude systems of communication became more than practical measures. They became symbols of trust, of shared struggle, and of the understanding that no man, no matter how hardened, could survive forever without the presence of others. To send a signal into the sky or walk toward a rendezvous was to affirm the bond of fellowship, the unwritten pact that those who braved the wilderness would look out for one another. And in that pact, as much as in their shelters or their stores of food, lay the true foundation of survival. For all the ingenuity of their shelters, their caches of food, their clever signals, and their hard-won routines of the mind, the mountain men never knew a day when vigilance could rest. In the Rockies, every system that kept them alive, whether it was the heat of the fire, the thickness of insulation between logs, the tightness of weatherproof seams, the invisible breath of ventilation, the security of stored food, or even the resilience of their thoughts demanded watchfulness at all times. Survival was not a triumph achieved once, to be celebrated and forgotten, but an ongoing battle fought anew each morning and evening, a discipline that tolerated no complacency. A man could spend weeks perfecting his cabin and lose it in a single night if his guard slipped. For the wilderness was always searching for weakness. The fire, so often called a man's closest ally, had to be watched with the eyes of a hawk. Embers needed tending, wood replenished, and smoke observed for signs of poor draft or blocked chimneys. Insulation, packed carefully between logs with clay, quass, or grass, slowly dried and shrank, opening fissures through which icy drafts crept unless patched without delay. Roofs that had shed a dozen storms could betray their builder on the 13th, sagging under fresh snow or allowing the drip of meltwater to seep inside. And ventilation, often overlooked by the inexperienced, had to remain balanced, for it was too easy to choke a cabin with smoke in the effort to conserve heat, or to let in so much fresh air that warmth bled away into the night. Even food, though it seemed secure once tucked into leather sacks or hidden in elevated caches, demanded vigilance. Stores had to be checked constantly for mold, for signs of chewing by rodents, or for the slow spoilage of fat in pemmican. Jerky grew brittle and sometimes crumbled to powder if not guarded against damp, while dried berries could attract insects if left too close to warmth. A man who assumed his food would wait patiently until needed often found himself betrayed by neglect. The same was true of water, for snow melting techniques demanded care each time, or else firewood might be wasted and energy lost. Perhaps most demanding of all was the mind. A lapse in vigilance that was not marked by a draft or a leak, but by silence that grew too deep, by days without routine, by thoughts that wandered too far into the dark. Those who failed to watch over their spirits as carefully as their shelters were often the first to succumb to despair. Thus, storytelling, journaling, and the discipline of routine became not pastimes, but safeguards, maintained with the same seriousness as repairing a roof or mending a seam. In this way, life in the Rockies was not defined by one great labor or single act of courage, but by the countless small acts of vigilance that bound together into survival. A loose log tightened, a crack patched, a meal rationed carefully. Story told to break silence. Each task was a thread in a fragile web that held back the crushing weight of the wilderness. And the men who endured longest were not those who built the grandest cabins or hunted the most game, but those who understood that vigilance was unending, that the work of survival had no finish, only continuation. For in the mountains, safety was never given, only guarded, hour by hour, by those determined enough to watch over every system as if their lives depended on it, because they did. Though the daily grind of vigilance wore heavy on body and mind, the mountain men understood a truth that rose above all their hardships, a final lesson etched into every frozen night and storm-tossed day. Survival in the Rockies was never a matter of chance. Nothing in their world was random, and every choice, however small, carried weight that could tilt the balance between life and death. To step outside without checking the sky could mean being caught in a storm too fierce to return from. To skimp on sealing a log seam might let in the wind that froze a man as he slept. To eat too much of a food cache in a moment of comfort might leave nothing when the hunt failed for weeks. The wilderness had no mercy for errors, and those who treated decisions casually soon vanished into its silence. This understanding shaped their every action. When they chose wood for a roof beam, they did not simply pick what lay nearest, they studied the grain, the strength, the season it was cut, for they knew that a weak log today could be the reason for collapse tomorrow. When they rationed their pemmican or melted snow for water, they did so with the awareness that each mouthful consumed now might cost them endurance later. Even their routines of storytelling, carving, or journaling were not idle diversions, but deliberate measures against despair. For a man who lost his grip on reason was as doomed as one who lost his fire. Every movement, every thought, every habit became part of a deliberate pattern of survival. What made this truth so stark was the cost of mistakes. The mountains did not forgive. Single slip with an axe could leave a hand crippled, turning daily labor into agony. A forgotten check of the roof might allow snow to crush it in the night. A poorly vented fire might smother its keeper as he slept. These were not tales told to frighten novices, but lessons drawn from the fates of real men whose names were whispered in warning around campfires and trading posts. Their errors lived on, not in their triumphs, but in their failures. Each story a grim reminder that vigilance without wisdom was still not enough. Every choice had to be made with care, because carelessness was as lethal as any predator or storm. And yet, within this harsh rule lay a strange kind of order, even dignity. The men who survived longest were not always the strongest or the most daring, but those who accepted that every detail mattered, that success came from humility before the land. They learned to see survival not as a battle won in a single stroke, but as a tapestry woven of countless decisions, each thread pulled carefully into place. The ultimate lesson, then, was not that life in the wilderness was impossible, but that It demanded respect, foresight, and a willingness to treat even the smallest task as essential. In the end, the Rockies left no room for chance. Those who endured did so because they understood that survival was not built on luck, but on choices made wisely and consistently, day after day. To thrive in such a place was to live with constant awareness, to weigh every act, to guard against every weakness, and to understand, always, that a single mistake could unravel everything. It was this truth, as cold and sharp as the wind itself, that shaped the mountain men into legends, leaving behind not only tales of hardship, but a legacy of discipline and resilience that still echoes across the silent peaks. As the story of the mountain men winds toward its close, one truth emerges with clarity. Life in the Rockies was an unending dialogue between human ingenuity and nature's relentless tests. These men entered a land where winter struck with blizzards that erased the horizon, where winds tore through valleys like unseen blades, and where the cold itself reached -30, a force that seemed almost alive in its intent to break the spirit. To remain in such a place was to accept daily battle, and yet, against all odds, they not only endured, but carved out a way of living that turned hardship into skill and desperation into discipline. Their survival was never left to chance. Every choice mattered, and every system they relied upon became both shield and teacher. Shelters rose not as crude huts, but as carefully engineered strongholds, made from the very materials the wilderness offered. Fire became their constant companion, its flame so sacred that a single phrase echoed in every cabin. Asterisk, fire dies, you die. Asterisk, it was warmth, protection, and hope in one, and they guarded it as fiercely as life itself. The placement of these shelters was no accident. Mountain men studied the land as carefully as scholars read books, learning which valleys would funnel wind, which slopes invited avalanches, and which riverbanks betrayed the danger of spring floods. Natural protections, hillsides, clusters of trees, or boulders were harnessed as allies, cutting heating needs in half, sparing men the back-breaking labor of endless woodcutting. Roofs were not simply built, but calculated, their angles steep enough to shed snow, yet strong enough to resist howling winds. Logs, chosen from lodgepole pine or Douglas fir, were cut in seasons that prevented warping or splitting, seasoned with patience, and placed with a precision that revealed not brute force, but empirical knowledge, earned through trial and error. Even the smallest details were sharpened into lifelines. Stone and timber foundations kept the cold ground from stealing heat. Chimneys doubled as heat exchangers to make the most of every flame. Thermal mass in the form of stones and clay absorbed the day's fire and whispered it back into the night as quiet warmth. Sleeping platforms were lifted to ride convection currents, while heated stones slipped into bedding turned icy nights into tolerable ones. Fuel was hoarded as though it were treasure, with entire weeks spent cutting, stacking, and protecting firewood from damp. And when storms lasted too long and wood piles dwindled to nothing, men burned what they could: pine cones, bark, even the handles of their tools, reminders that fire remained the dividing line between survival and silence. But survival was not merely physical. A shelter could be built strong, food stored carefully, water melted efficiently. And still, a man might fail if his mind turned against him. The mountain men understood this bitterly, for isolation cut as deeply as hunger. Winter madness, as it came to be known, claimed men who had every material need but no defense against solitude. To resist it, they carved wood into tokens, they told stories aloud to the fire, they wrote journals to give form to passing days, and they shaped routines to impose order on chaos. In these rituals, they safeguarded their humanity, proving that endurance of the spirit was as crucial as endurance of the body. Nor did they ignore the strength found in others. Communication systems, whether the distant curl of smoke in the sky or prearranged rendezvous points, tied them together across the vast wilderness. In emergencies, Such connections meant the difference between perishing alone and finding aid. Theirs was not a brotherhood built on comfort, but on mutual recognition that no man, no matter how hardened, could face the mountains entirely alone. Maintenance was ceaseless, emergencies planned for, food rationed with discipline, and even moments of rest were earned through constant vigilance. For the Rockies punished carelessness without hesitation. Every crack in a wall, every leak in a roof, every careless indulgence at the food storehouse could grow swiftly into disaster. The mountains demanded that nothing be left to chance, that every decision, large or small, be made with purpose. And so, the ultimate lesson left by the mountain men was stark but enduring. Survival was never random. Each action was essential, and every mistake carried consequences, sometimes fatal ones. Yet, within this harsh truth lay the blueprint for resilience. By respecting the land, by treating every choice as vital, and by weaving together skill, discipline, and foresight, they not only endured, but became legends of endurance. Their lives remind us that strength is not found in resisting hardship alone, but in respecting its lessons, adapting to its tests, and guarding against its perils with constant care. As we close this journey into the world of the mountain men, may their stories serve as both warning and inspiration. The mountains they faced were merciless, but their resilience was unbreakable. And perhaps, in listening to their lessons, we find a quiet strength for our own storms, great or small. Now, as the fire in our tale burns low, may you rest well. Carry the wisdom of these stories with you. Drift into sleep with warmth in your heart. Good night, everyone.